And good afternoon from Philadelphia. Frank here with another episode of UFO News Network Sunday. Today we've got a number of guests. We've got 4 in total spanning the continent. So let's start way out west and bring on author and researcher Noe Torres. Author and researcher Ruben Uriarte, author and researcher from Mexico, Carlos Guzman, and witness to the Coyame UFO case, Tony Ramirez. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us, and good afternoon to all of you.
Good afternoon, Frank.
Yeah. So, Noe, let's start with you and give us a little background about how you got into all this UFO stuff, if you could.
Yes, sir, Frank. Again, all of us appreciate being on your show today, along with Chant, who will join us shortly.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. The traffic gods willing. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm Noe Torres, and I live in South Texas on the border with Mexico. And I had been compiling putting together a book of UFO cases from Texas. And I was doing searches both in my local libraries and also online when I ran across this very interesting story from 1974. In fact, 45 years ago today, August 25th, 1974, where a mysterious UFO incident happened right along the Texas-Mexico border in West Texas, which we will describe more in detail as the day goes along. But about the only person that was doing research on that specific case at the time was a gentleman who is one of your guests tonight and is my friend and co-author, Ruben Uriarte, from San Francisco Bay Area. So Ruben and I contacted him. I actually contacted 5 or 6 other people who had something to say about the case, and he was the one who responded to me immediately. In fact, within a couple of hours of me sending an email. And thus began correspondence and working together. We've done about close to 10 books now that we've worked on together collaboratively. And but the very first book was the one about this 1974 case that we'll be talking about today. So that's how it all got started. And we have actually now written 3 books about this one case. We've been on several television shows for the History Channel and the Travel Channel. And so it continues to be a case that is fascinating because it has a lot of the same elements as the Roswell UFO crash. But it happened much closer in time to where we are today, 1974. So we'll have definitely a lot more to say about it over the course of this program today.
Got it. And Ruben, let's bring you in and tell us a little bit about your involvement in UFOs. You're also the Northern California director for MUFON. Is that about right?
Yes, the state director. Thank you.
It's a big enough state they need more than one of you?
Yeah, yes, we're divided. We have Southern California and we have Northern California. And I'm connected with international, where I work closely with and assist other countries as needed. As Noe had mentioned, it's been 45 years as of today that this extraordinary event happened there right across the border. About 40 miles south of Presidio, in an area known as Coyame. And we've been real fortunate to network with a number of investigators, specifically from Mexico. We have Mr. Carlos Guzman, who is a well-known author and researcher in Mexico and Latin America. And we've also have collaborated with him and several others on this unique case. So it's been really very interesting. And then, of course, having a witness who was there, who experienced something quite extraordinary is also, we're very fortunate having Tony Ramirez on the show. So we really appreciate Frank and Chant having us on your show.
Yeah, with just to explain, we have technical difficulties now and then, but they usually relate to computers and stream connections and things like that. But today, unfortunately, her issue is technical regarding her vehicle. So that's where she's at. She's stuck somewhere in Phoenix, and she'll be joining us hopefully before we wrap up here. And Carlos, come on in and tell us a little bit about yourself. And if you guys have to translate, Carlos, English is a second language, but we went back and forth a little bit. So, Carlos, please introduce yourself to everybody and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity and to speak with you and your guests. Well, I have been involved in the UFO research since I was very child. I started to study at around 12 when I was 12 years old, and now I has written about 5-6 books about this. And the first time that I heard about the Coyame incident was in the end of the 90s. At that time, I heard some Mexican researchers that live in Chihuahua, Mexico, and they said that something happened in 1974, but until Noe and Ruben was more interested in this case, I know that something really had happened. And well, I started to look if I can find some news in the newspaper of that period, and I found some strange notice that I will comment during your show. And again, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. And of course, last but not least, the witness to the case, we've got Tony Ramirez here. And Tony, you witnessed this, and tell us a little bit about how these guys found you. And of course, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm honored to be on your show. And basically, I didn't witness the crash at first. Basically, the way I ran into Ruben and Noe was I was listening to a radio show called Coast to Coast, and real avid listener of that program. I've always been into UFOs and stuff like that. So I was listening to the show, and they were talking about the Coyame incident, and I recall them. The year that it happened, and I went, wow, my parents and I, along with my brothers, as far as I can remember back, went to Coyame as soon as we got out of school. Within a couple of days, we were on the road, and we spent the entire summer there, and so it brought back that memory. Not that I'd forgotten about it. It just, I just went on with my life after the incident. But so I'm listening to them, and I went, Coyame, man, that's where we're from. What are they bringing Coyame up for? So I called the show, and I got in contact with them. I told them my story on the show, and that's how it got started.
So basically, it was what family lived in the area. So you went back during the summer and hung out. Is that basically it, or is it like a tourist area? Or
well, our family has a history there. We have a ranch there that's called El Saucito, and so it's owned by cousins now. But it originally belonged to my grandfather, and my father was raised there at the ranch. He used to, they used to sell cheese called asadero. They make it at the ranch, and then, my dad would go to Coyame and sell it. Anytime something happened, they were at Coyame. But basically we had family in Coyame and then on the ranches in Chihuahua, Juarez. So yeah, we were always there during the summers, and it was just, I was just there enjoying it as a kid. And, as far back as I can remember, we went to Coyame.
Got it. And Noe and Ruben and Carlos, how did you find out about this case? Go ahead, Noe. Absolutely. How did you find out about this case?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was writing a book kind of collecting a lot of UFO stories from Texas. I had written some books on local history, and I had always been fascinated by the paranormal dating back to my childhood. In the 60s, I remember reading lots of books by Frank Edwards and many of the big paranormal authors. Later on, Eric von Daniken and his Chariots of the Gods series. So it's something that I was always fascinated by.
And how did you get your first tip that something happened in Coyame? Hello?
Hello.
Sorry,
okay.
I popped out for a second, but I'm back. It's a funny answer to your question, how I first got wind of this particular case in 1974. I was compiling stories and doing library research, and then I came across a mention online of a document called the Deneb Report. Deneb, D-E-N-E-B. It's a star system constellation we'll talk more about as the show goes on. But the Deneb Report was a top secret document that, or purported to be a top secret document that was smuggled out from the U.S. intelligence community that mentioned a crash retrieval recovery operation by the CIA of a downed flying saucer in the desert about 20 miles west of Candelaria, Texas, just on the other side of the Rio Grande River, which is north of Coyame, the small town of Coyame. So I saw that, became fascinated by it, and then coincidentally, the History Channel had a program at that time called the UFO Files. And I noticed when I was browsing through the channel listings that they were going to talk about the Coyame incident. And one of the persons who was being interviewed for that show was a gentleman from San Francisco area called Mr. Ruben Uriarte. So with that information in mind, I tuned into the show, and it was amazing to hear. We'll be telling the story in great detail as tonight's show develops, but when I first heard about it, I was just amazed and astounded. So I immediately took note of all the persons who were interviewed in that segment, in that History Channel show, UFO Files show, and one of the people was Ruben Uriarte, our other guest tonight, and he contacted me right away. And although originally I had envisioned writing a chapter of a larger book, eventually, after talking to Ruben and the two of us working together for several weeks, it became clear that there was enough material for an entire book, which ended up being a 300-plus page book, which we called Mexico's Roswell, the Chihuahua UFO crash, which we released in 2007. So it's been 12 years since the release of our book, and that's how the story developed. Then other people became involved. When we made several trips down to Coyame, Chihuahua, and we talked to a lot of the townspeople. We interviewed other researchers such as Carlos Guzman to see if they could shed additional light on this rather fascinating case. And then, interestingly enough, as we'll talk about more later when we get to that part of the story, we found some witnesses on the Texas side at the time that this incident happened who saw several of the events that are part of the narrative of the incident itself. So on the Texas side, in 1974, we found 2 eyewitnesses to the events of the crash and retrieval. So that's basically just a quick timeline without specific details, which we will get into shortly.
Yeah, let's get into those details. Tell us about this incident and why it's gotten you so fascinated. And Ruben, let's start with you there.
Yeah. Can you hear me there?
Yep, you're just fine. You sound great.
Okay. Yeah, as Noe was mentioned, he saw the documentary in regards to Mexico's Roswell. In fact, that was the title of the documentary. And I was working with several producers from the History Channel. They had contacted me and they wanted to do a story on UFOs in Mexico and network with a number of the Mexican investigators. But one thing I did not know was that they were doing a series of crash retrievals, and they had a number of other countries as well, like Russia's Roswell, China's Roswell, etc., and of course Mexico's Roswell. And when they aired that, that's when I was very fortunate to be a part of this, because they were looking at having other researchers to do the narration, but no one was available until they asked me, "Hey, Ruben, would you be willing to narrate and share your thoughts?" And I said, "Sure." And that's how we connected, both Noe and I. And then, as he had mentioned, we've been collaborating on a number of other crash retrieval stories and other historical UFO cases. And then we've also been very blessed with connecting with researchers like Carlos Guzman, and he has a vast network and connections as well. So it's been quite a great experience. And of course, meeting Tony, which we'll go into depth. As Noe had mentioned, he's going to, either he or I will talk about the UFO incident.
Yeah, let's get into all that. And whoever wants to start, tell us about what actually happened.
Okay, Ruben, I'm gonna get started, and then you can fill in the details or step in if I forget anything.
Go ahead, please.
So we're talking about August 25th, 1974, the evening of. It was getting to be around 9 p.m. Central Time in Texas, and suddenly the radar screens at the Naval Air Station in Corpus Christi, Texas, that's on the Gulf Coast. It's south of Houston. It's right along the water's edge. So the radar screens at the Naval Air Station in Corpus Christi suddenly light up with a strange object that was inbound to Texas from the Gulf of Mexico at a very high speed, over 2,000 miles per hour, and at a very high altitude. The frantic radar operators immediately sounded the alert, thinking that there were only a limited number of possibilities as to what this object could be, and the most worrisome being that it was some kind of inbound ICBM. Corpus Christi is a major port town, a major port city in Texas. A lot of shipping goes in and out, so it was more likely than not a primary target of the Russians, of the Soviet Union at that time in '74. And so that would explain why there was a lot of concern when this object was seen inbound on the radar screens. As these guys watched, the object suddenly made a 90-degree angle turn to the south. So in other words, it was inbound, more or less traveling to the west toward the Texas coast, and then suddenly zigzagged and made a 90-degree angle turn heading south. Now, south in the Gulf of Mexico, still 100 miles or so off the Texas coast. So it was essentially skirting the Texas coast until it got down to around Brownsville. which is near where I live. I live in the extreme southern part of Texas. And then suddenly it made another 90-degree angle turn into northern Mexico, just past Brownsville, turned into northern Mexico. That's an extremely sparsely populated area of Mexico. It's an area of Mexico that over the years has gotten hit by a lot of major hurricanes. There's not a large population center anywhere around there. So then the interesting thing is, as this object traveled, it slowed down and descended, and it followed more or less the course of the Rio Grande River, but on the south side of the Texas-Mexico border. So it was, Ruben and I have looked at the map of this object zigzagging all over the map after it was first spotted. And we noticed one thing that's very apparent is that it seemed to be avoiding all the large metropolitan or population centers, both in Texas and northern Mexico. So
just to jump in, it's roughly maintaining this 2,000 mile an hour speed, which is roughly Mach 3. I mean, that's a really quick aircraft.
At some point, it came down to about 1,250 miles per hour, and it came down in altitude quite a bit. I don't remember exactly. I think we were at around between 40 and 50,000 feet right before the incident that we're about to describe happened. But it was descending and it was slowing down. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the southern part of Texas, there's a number of military installations all along the Texas-Mexico border. And throughout the state of Texas. San Antonio, which is kind of in the geographical center of the state, has 5 or 6 major military bases. And then there are bases all along the Texas-Mexico border, including Laughlin Air Force Base in Del Rio, and the big Air Force Base in El Paso, which we'll talk about more, Bliss. Not Air Force, but Army. So all of these military bases became involved in tracking this thing as it skirted the Rio Grande River on the Mexican side, headed north-northwest, when suddenly, at the same time, it's getting to be around 10 p.m. in Texas, and a small aircraft, which we think had 2 occupants, the pilot and one other person, took off from El Paso International Airport, ELP, and was headed south toward Mexico City. Well, according to our analysis of flight paths and all that, at that time it was common for planes headed from El Paso to Mexico City to take the route that we think was what the plane was taking when it collided with this object. So the collision between the small plane and the very fast-moving UFO, which by this time had descended quite low to where it came into the flight path of the oncoming plane, and the fiery collision, the fireball, was seen over the skies of Coyame, Chihuahua, Mexico, right along the Texas border. And that time was around 10:30 p.m. Texas time.
If I can jump in and ask a real quick question, how did you find out that this object was being tracked on radar?
Okay, that gets back to the Deneb report, which we're going to have more to say about. It appears to have been the work of a group of military insiders who were collecting information on major UFO cases and were smuggling that information out from the secret files that the U.S. government maintains. So the Deneb report tells us that all of this was being tracked and was being followed, and then it also tells us what happens next, because the debris from both craft, well, actually the debris from the plane rained down to the desert below. It was all in small pieces. But the ship, the UFO itself, crash landed down in the desert below in a fairly intact condition. By the time the retrieval teams got there, there was no sign of survivors. There was no sign of entities, beings of any kind associated with the UFO. However, this is where Tony Ramirez's story becomes incredibly important, because he had an encounter at the time, shortly after the crash happened. He had an entity encounter in Coyame. So one immediately makes the association between this crash and the entities that he saw, as we'll hear later on. But
yeah, let's go over to that. But one last question: do we know what happened with the? I'm assuming this is a private plane, based on the illustration on the cover of your book.
This is a private plane that was headed, as I said, from El Paso to Mexico City, and we have both Carlos Guzman and, well, not just Carlos, but other Mexican UFO investigators, Ruben and I, have all been on the track for years trying to determine who was in that plane, but we have unfortunately been unable to find any information about it. It's been expunged or hidden from view, removed, where we're not completely sure what happened, but we've not had any success there.
If this is Ruben, if I could just also add to what Noe had shared with us, one of the interesting parts of this investigation was that during the time of the UFO crash, it was the next day that the Mexican military was involved in the search and rescue, and they found this disc, as Noe had mentioned. Can you hear me there, Frank?
Yeah, you sound great. You sound fantastic.
Okay.
Keep going.
Okay, and so as Noe had mentioned, throughout this period, that craft was being monitored, and so the U.S. military had sent surveillance airplanes and spy satellites to focus on what was happening. And the Mexican military had a Mexican truck convoy to retrieve the UFO. It was small. It was a small disc. It was approximately 16 feet in diameter and about 5 feet in thickness or in height. So the Mexican soldiers were able to put the craft on the truck, and they were departing in a convoy. And then the surveillance plane noticed that the convoy had stopped, and as they were getting closer with their cameras, they were able to see that all the Mexican soldiers, were laying on the ground. So immediately there was a U.S. military helicopter team that flew out of Fort Bliss. There were about approximately 4 helicopters. They flew from El Paso along the border, and he entered into Mexican airspace in a little nearby town called Candelaria. So, and the other thing was that the American soldiers were wearing protective biological suits. So the U.S. team arrived, and they discovered that all the Mexican soldiers were dead. So they were able to gather the debris, but they also attached the UFO to a very large, giant helicopter known as a Sea Stallion, and it was connected.
Ruben, just to jump in really quick, how many Mexican soldiers are we talking about here?
Noe, I think we had estimated maybe around possibly a team of 24. Was it either a dozen or 2 dozen at the most? But
yeah, it was characteristic of deployments at that time to send out about 20, somewhere between 20 and 30 men out of that base. The nearest base would have been in Chihuahua City, Mexican Air Force Base.
And what's interesting, again, all this information is coming out of the Deneb report. And so they took the saucer over to an area known as the Davis Mountains, and that's located right there in West Texas. And what the U.S. soldiers did was they gathered all the dead bodies and all the vehicles, and they destroyed them. We think it was probably due to quarantine, because the death of the Mexican soldiers may have been caused by a virus. And the reason why we say that is that in the report, they mentioned that the convoy of trucks, they transported the disc into Atlanta, Georgia, and we were wondering what's in Atlanta, Georgia, and then we figured that is the headquarters of the Agency for Disease Control, or the CDC.
Exactly.
And so or to another military base, but as you know, they are really equipped with specialized labs that study these different types of deadly viruses throughout the world. So we think that it's all part of that whole quarantine aspect of it.
And this is a really interesting time frame too. You're talking August of '74. And a lot's going on in the Gulf, because this is maybe within a year of the Pascagoula abduction case. I don't know how familiar you guys are with that, but that was a huge case back in those days. So a lot's going on, and the Gulf has long been a very interesting place as far as UFO sightings.
So one of our main objectives was to go out to Coyame and see if we could find any witnesses. And we went into these into the town of Coyame, and then to the outskirts, into these areas, these ranches that I'm sure Tony will talk about, his ranch, or ejidos, I believe is the term. And so we began talking to people, and then what was really interesting was we also interviewed people from the U.S. side of the border, and of course the connection with Tony's experience.
Yeah, let's bring Tony in and tell us your story, Tony.
Well, again, I recall, we, as far as I can remember, we always went to Coyame during the summer. My family is from Coyame, Chihuahua. My family back in those, they still have a ranch. It's called El Saucito. And what kind of triggered my attention was that one day I was watching, I believe it was the History Channel. It was, I think, in the mid-'90s or so. And the story, or the documentary about Coyame, I remember just hearing the word Coyame, and I went, "Whoa, what's going on here?" And it's just, nothing ever happens in Coyame. I mean, it's a real small town. Everybody knew each other, and just slow. It was just, it was just fun to be there, as far as I was concerned as a youth. And but what triggered my attention was that they said it happened in 1974, and I went, wait a second, I was there around that time. And that got everything rolling. And basically what I'll do is I'll tell my story. Back in 1974 or so, we went to Coyame on vacation, and we basically spent the whole summer there. And along with doing all the things that kids do, my thing was riding horses. I loved riding horses. So that morning, or that particular day, I don't remember exactly what day it was, but I borrowed a horse from an uncle, and early in the morning, and just he saddled it up for me, and my mom. I remember my mom making me a lunch, because what I would do is just ride around the town. I didn't go out into the desert or anything. I just listened to my mom, and she said just hang around the town. And so yeah, I rode the horse all day long. And then it finally got dark, and I took the horse back to my uncle's house, and he had all the homes over there had corrals in the back of the property. So because it was dark, I didn't have a flashlight or anything. I was to walk around. I mean, there's tarantulas, there's all kinds of stuff. So basically, I just tied the horse to the fence by the house and went to my other uncle's house where we were staying at the time, and he had a little store, and it was just across the street from the placita, and across the street from the main building, or the municipal. And so I went home, and everybody was just sitting around eating and having dinner. And shortly thereafter, my uncle, who I borrowed the horse from, came over, and he was really upset, and said, "Hey, you don't just tie the horse. The horses have to eat, they have to drink water. You got to take the saddle off." And so my dad got upset, and he made me go and take care of the horse. And one of the things that I had to do was go cut the hay out in the field. Now, this happened in Coyame, the town itself. So there's a road behind the town, just to the north of the town. There's a church there, and it leads to the swimming pool. It's a public pool. They've had that there for as far as I can remember. And the hay was right across a little irrigation ditch. So I had to jump over the ditch and then go to where the hay was, and then just within, I would estimate about 30 to 40 feet, maybe 50 feet, there was a corn stalks. So I went over there, and I had I don't remember what you call the instrument to cut the hay with, but I had a flashlight and I had that instrument. So I started gathering up the hay and cutting it, and right at that point, I hear something rustling the corn stalks. Now it was a clear, bright night. The moon was bright, so it wasn't as though it was real dark. So I'm sitting there, and I look up, and I see something inside or within the corn stalks, and it was all I could see were two what I thought back then were eyes, but they weren't very high off the ground, and that caught my attention. And then I stood up, and as I stood up, this little, now I have to say it was an entity, but it looked like a tiny person. It couldn't have been more than 3 feet tall. It stepped out of the cornfield and looked at me, or its attention was what I thought was toward me. And I just remember the hair standing up the back of my neck, and I didn't know what to do, and I remember shaking. It just scared me to the core. And about that point, it started walking to my left, and almost as if it was walking towards the pool area. And I just dropped everything. I turned and I ran as fast as I could. I remember my younger brother and my cousin, one of my cousins. I guess my parents or my aunt or uncle sent them to make sure I was okay.
Right.
So they're walking up the road towards me, and I was running. I just remember running past them as fast as I could, and ran back to the house. And I remember I was crying. I just started crying, and I was shaken up, and I remember everybody saying, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And I couldn't talk. And I remember my aunt giving me a glass of water with. I remember her putting a lot of sugar in it. I don't know why they did that, but they gave it to me, and it seemed to settle me down. And then I told the story, and they all said, well, see, that's what you get. Little diablito got on you, and so it was always a little diablito, and so that's I thought, this is my religious turnaround here,
right,
because I said, man, I saw the devil, but
how old were Tony? Real quick, how old were you at this point?
I was about 15 years old.
Okay, so yeah, you're all right. Okay.
So back then I was kind of small for my age in stature, and but I getting back to what I saw, all I recall is the way it walked was really awkward. I got the feeling that it was floating more than it was walking on solid ground. And I say that because the way it walked was almost like a slumbering, slow walk. And that's pretty much as far as I saw before I turned and ran.
Right.
But I did recall that it had, the eyes were glow. It was almost like a glowing, almost like when you see a red laser. That's what they looked like. Now, they weren't lasers. They weren't, the light coming out of them or anything like that. They just kind of glowed like a laser. And it had a big, kind of like a teardrop shaped head. The head was, a lot bigger than what I thought afterward would be supported by such a small body. But it had, I couldn't tell whether it had a mouth or nose or ears. I just remember the eyes. And then just above the eyes, it had kind of like 3 horns. I wouldn't say horns. They were just protrusions, like lumps on the top of the head. And after I heard Noe and Ruben on Coast to Coast, I remember seeing another show or another program in Brazil where some girls came across an entity, and there was supposedly a UFO crash, and there was a picture. I was watching this documentary, and I remember they showed a picture of this little entity that they saw, and right away, I just went, "That's what I saw. Right. That's exactly what I saw." I remember that, and but anyway, I recall my grandmother. Now again, my family has a ranch. It's called El Salcito, and it's I believe it's just west of Coyame. I remember when we would go to the ranch, we'd take the main road out of the town, and it was a dirt road, and it was maybe about I'd say a 45-minute drive from there. I just remember when I was a kid, it was a long drive, and we would stop on the way and use the bathroom, do whatever, just sometimes when it was raining, we, the arroyos would be flooded, and, my uncle had one of those big flatbed with the fence stake that I think they call it, and, but, my dad had a station wagon, so we had to wait till the water slowed down, and then we'd cross, and we'd jump out and get in the water and just, have a good time. And then we'd go to the ranch, and that was it. But yeah, I remember my grandmother talking about the life in the ranch back in the day. And she I told her about what happened, and she says, "Well, yeah, we used to see them all the time. They get up real early in the morning. I think at 5 o'clock in the morning. My grandmother and they were. It was like a little community. All the sons and daughters lived there." And I remember all my mom and dad telling me, "Yeah, that little house right there. Yeah, that was our house. It was all practically gone, from the weather and everything. But they all lived together on the ranch, not in the main house, but everybody had their own little adobe house. And my grandmother would get up earlier and start breakfast and earn coffee and what have you. And she said that she would see these little diablitos, she said, would run around and hide. They'd run from one place to another and hide. And she also mentioned that they would steal the salt licks that they would put out for the cows. They did have a storage shed, or it was made out of adobe, and they had everything stored there. And she mentioned, I don't know why I remembered that, but that was kind of something that kind of stuck out in my mind about why would they steal the salt licks.
Right.
And that's basically what happened. And later on, as I went on through my life, I was always interested in UFOs. I remember my freshman year in high school, I was in the library and they had the book of the Roswell book. I don't recall who wrote it or anything, but it caught my eye and I got it and I sat down and I started reading it, and then I ended up buying one. I think at Salvation Army somewhere, where my parents used to shop for stuff for us. And I kept that book and I would read it over and over and over again. And then, of course, later on, as an adult, I heard, I was an avid listener to Coast, and that's when I was listening, and Noe and Ruben were guests on the show, and they were talking about the Coyame incident. And I got on the phone and I just started battling over and over again, trying to get through, and I finally got through, and they put me on air and I talked to them. I don't recall who it was that said, "Hey, can you hold on and give us your information and we'll talk to you after?" I said, "Sure, no problem." And I gave them all my information, and thus everything started with at least my story.
Yeah, you had mentioned the individual that you saw looked a good bit like the descriptions that came out of Varginha in Brazil. And I was able to gin up a few quick images and have them in here just to, add some visuals to help the folks out with an idea of what you're describing here with the red eyes. And you said the three ridges on top of the head as well?
Yes. And when I saw the documentary of that Brazil incident, it just, the same thing happened over again. The hair on the back of my neck just stood up, and I went, wow, I was there. Did this have something to do with that? The crash happened. And by the way, just to add a little extra segment to it, when we were there, I don't recall anybody talking. I don't recall anybody mentioning the military or anything. 9 o'clock, at night, we were almost, basically in the house, in bed, ready to fall asleep. Back then they didn't have electricity. They had a generator that kept the lights on in the placita. One phone, and that was it. So, if it happened sometime around 10 o'clock, I don't think anybody would have known about it. If there was a military going through I doubt very much if the military actually went through the town, because we would have known about it. Everybody would have been talking about it. I mean, I remember, I think it was the year before, maybe in '73 or so, there was a stranger that drowned in a river nearby Coyame, and they had his body there. I mean, it was just, but the whole town was there to see the body.
Right.
It was just, something like that happens. Everybody was there, or everybody was talking about it or knew about it. I don't remember anybody saying anything, or hearing explosions or anything like that. The town was shut down at about 9:00. So everybody would have been indoors and, in bed or getting ready to go to sleep or what have you. So,
and the way sound travels when you're out in the, out in those rural areas, somebody likely would have heard something too.
But yeah, I mean, but again, I mean, we were indoors. Even at night when they would have, parties or fiestas or stuff like that. And by the way, Coyame still has them. I think they have them twice a year. But while we were there, if everybody was out late, it would have been 10:00 at the latest.
Right.
So
right.
So I don't think anybody would have known or noticed or heard or anything about any of those incident or any of those things that may have or happened. By the way, also, I also recall my cousins talking about seeing lights in the sky, and I remember one night, and I don't think it was that same year, we went out jackrabbit hunting, and we saw these lights come down from the north over the mountain just north of Coyame, and they descended on the side of the mountain, and I remember we were talking about, wow, what's this? But they were far away. But they were close enough where you could see the light, the lights coming from these objects on the ground, and then you could see the cows running from the light, and it was almost like the lights were shining down onto the cows, and the cows would run from the light. And my cousins, I remember them saying, oh yeah, they're so, in Spanish they're saying son ovnis. And I remember that one particular night that the lights went back up the side of the mountain to the top of the mountain, and then they shot off to the west. And then, thinking back now after learning all this stuff from Ruben and Noe and listening to all these shows, and it really meant, that they, I guess they call that the zona muerta or something like that, Ruben or Noe. But yeah, I mean, even the people there would talk about stuff like that. They wouldn't refer to them as UFOs, or ovnis. A lot of times they'd say, oh yeah, son los diablos, or the, Los Angeles, or, they would just refer to it as that, and that was it. But, yeah, that's my story.
Got it. Okay.
I wanted to jump in, Frank, real quick,
Sure.
and confirm what Tony's saying, that Ruben and I spent some time in Coyame on several occasions talking to the townspeople and to some of the outlying people who live in outlying ranches. We found out by a careful study of the Deneb document that the crash in the case of the Coyame UFO incident happened approximately 60 miles northeast of the small town of Coyame. So that is quite a distance. We also encountered the question on several occasions where people would ask us, well, we didn't see anything in town. We heard nothing in town. But when you stop and think about it, that's quite a distance away from the actual town. Now, the fact that there were no entities found at the crash-landed UFO was always an interesting point to Ruben and me, because we felt that unless the ship was unmanned, there was a possibility that entities had been there, and after the crash landing, they made their way to the nearest major population center, which would have been the town of Coyame, which, if we correlate all this out on a map, there was also a story that we were told where the entities were floating away from the crash site, supposedly seen by witnesses, entities floating away. So it certainly seems reasonable that within a day or two, they might have made it to the location around the town of Coyame. Now, when Ruben and I went and interviewed the townspeople, and also, let me just back up and say, the ranch closest to the point where we think the impact happened is a place called El Llano. And what we did was we took a four-wheel drive vehicle down this road north from Coyame called La Brecha. And basically it's just a dirt road. You have to go through a number of ravines. It really is a rough way to go, and you have to take it at a very slow speed, maybe 20-30 miles an hour the whole way. So it took us an entire day to make it out to the location 60 miles northeast of Coyame, where we feel the initial crash happened. And out there at the ranch closest to that location, we talked to a gentleman who had lived there for many years, and he lived there in 1974. And he remembered a night, although he didn't remember the exact date, he remembered a night when there was a terrific explosion, and his windows rattled in his little house. His windows rattled so severely that he felt certain that the glass was going to be smashed to smithereens. There was definitely an earth-shaking explosion. The earth shook, his windows rattled, and then he pulled out this dusty old notebook from one of the rooms in the back, and he said that after that night he began documenting every time he saw strange lights and strange objects in the hills around his little ranch. And Ruben and I were just amazed when he opened this book. There were just tons of listings of strange objects that he saw after that 1974 incident. So, and the same types of stories, such as Tony told us about entities being seen and lights in the sky, they just predominated in the town of Coyame. We even heard it from the mayor and his wife, who were longtime residents of the area. And there seems to be a definite energy, or it seems to be a definite trend. There's some kind of strange goings on in that little town where nothing really seems to ever happen, and yet there's this underlying kind of deep, dark secret there.
Yeah. If I could jump in real quickly, and I know Carlos has a lot to share with us too, but we have a friend who's also an investigator, Uriarte Rivera. He runs the UFO organization in Chihuahua, and he had shared that several of their witnesses have also seen this type of being that Tony had just described. And then the other thought is that there might be an underground alien base somewhere in that whole region. So that's another interesting theory behind this. I'll stop here.
And Carlos, why don't you come in and tell us about some of the background investigating you did on this case, as far as finding newspaper accounts, and also there is apparently a pilot mishap around the same time frame. So if you could tell us a little bit more about that, that would be great. Hello, Carlos. Yeah, Carlos, you have your mic muted. So if you could unmute your mic.
Could you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes, sir. Did you hear my question?
Yes.
Okay,
I heard
great.
your question. Yes, let me tell you some interesting thing that I found as a recommendation of Noe and Ruben. They request to me that I look in the newspaper of here that was published in Mexico at that time, and I could find that newspaper because here in Mexico City, the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico have the main newspaper all around Mexico. So the first, let me try to remember, the first news that I found is about that the Mexican ufology Pedro Ferriz Santa Cruz, which is already, he died 5 years ago. Pedro Ferriz was a pioneer here in Mexico, and I found news that the newspaper wrote that man visited Coyame at that time. For me, it was a very big surprise because that person was very well ufology research here in Mexico. Is a man who worked for the many medias in Mexico, TV, radio, newspaper, etc. And that news said that we were a couple of weeks before the incident in Coyame. Well, that's one of the news that catch my attention, and I talk about this to Ruben and Noe. The other news that I found is that at that time President Ford, who was the president of the United States, and Luis Echeverría Álvarez was a Mexican president at that time. The news said that the President Ford requests an encounter, requests a meeting with the Mexican president, and also again, for me was a very big surprise.
Sure.
Why? Yeah, what the United States president are requesting a reunion to see and to talk. Not, of course, the main point perhaps is always that both presidents through the history talk the problems of the border, the problem with the drugs, etc. But what the second newspaper that I found very strange, but nothing is for coincidence. The other news that I found in the newspaper was that
Carlos,
yes.
Can I just say something real quick?
Yes.
The encounter between President Ford and the President of Mexico was very strange. I remember that after you told us that story, I looked it up, and it says that the two presidents came together by themselves, apart from all of their aides and the people who traveled with them. They went walking side by side. They were engaged in a conversation that nobody heard and nobody knew what they were talking about. They just met at the international boundary. The two presidents started walking off by themselves. There were hand gestures back and forth between them. And then when they came back, then everybody was very quiet about what they had talked about. Nobody ever found out what they had talked about. So I thought that was an extremely unusual event, and I'm so glad you brought that up, Carlos.
Yeah, and just a little bit of background. Gerald Ford had taken over the presidency from Richard Nixon. roughly, I guess I'm looking it up now. It seems to recall that it was late summer. If you folks remember, maybe some younger folks aren't really familiar with it. Nixon had resigned because of the Watergate issue, and he sort of took over in, let's see, when that was the exact date. So, you would figure him just coming into the presidency.
I think that was 72. And the other very significant thing is that Gerald Ford had a substantial UFO encounter himself that he was a witness to. And so he was very interested in the topic, which is another interesting angle here, that the president of Mexico met with Ford. They talked privately on the border, very close to where this incident happened, because this was Ciudad Juarez, El Paso area. And then nothing was said about what they talked about, although we looked up in the presidential records for Gerald Ford, and it indicates that they did meet, but it doesn't talk about, it doesn't give any reason for the meeting or what they discussed. And then plus, on top of that, you had Ford's intense interest, personal interest in UFOs from his own sighting.
Yeah, he had been a congressman from Michigan, and there were a lot of sightings there, and he was the one who got a congressional hearing going in the late 60s. But he took office on August 9th of 74. And, for those old enough to remember, the country was in a lot of turmoil. So for him to sort of drop everything with a lot on his plate, obviously relations with Mexico are pretty stable. So for him to drop everything and go meet with the president of Texas in that time frame is very interesting.
Like Carlos says, there weren't any pressing border issues at that time like we have now with Trump. Back then, it was just like Carlos mentioned, it was just the minor, everyday, if you can call them everyday, issues of the drugs flowing across the border and things like that. But there was nothing pressing in the agenda. If you look at the news coverage of the time, there seemed to be nothing big that they would have been meeting about. And it's so odd that it happened right after this August 25th, 1974 incident.
Right. So, the Mexico-U.S. relations have really been stable for a long time now, and we'll avoid the politics of today. But going back then, it is very interesting that Ford and the president of Mexico, and what was his name at the time?
Mexican president was Luis Echeverría Álvarez.
Got it. Okay. And, you live down there. Anything in particular about that president that you can share with the folks? Anything that really stands out for folks who aren't familiar with his history?
Well, no.
Okay. Just fairly, everything ran pretty smooth while he was there then. Okay.
Carlos, did he have any involvement with other UFO cases? Echevarria, did he ever express any interest in ovnis himself that you know of?
Yes. Echeverría was witnesses in 1975 in Cuernavaca. Cuernavaca is a small town about less than an hour by car from Mexico City to there. And at that time in 1965, in Mexico registered the biggest wave that happened here in Mexico. All days, at any time, the UFOs was reporting from all the state of Mexico, and one of them belongs to Echeverría. And at that time, what very important with that sighting that Echeverría was a witness. Also, at that time was a witness the Presidente Municipal of Cuernavaca. And Echeverría was very interested in this subject. If you remember, in 1968, the NASA requests a special permission that the American astronauts came to Sonora, Mexico, in order to make some practice, because in Sonora there are a desert that, according with NASA, said that are very similar, like in the moon.
That's
So
correct.
yes, so the NASA request to the Mexican government that if the U.S. astronauts could came to here in Mexico, and also Bombran was there, and Echeverria said, okay, the Mexican government give the permission to make the practice here in Mexican territory.
There's another dimension to this which we haven't touched on, Frank, that's very interesting regarding U.S.-Mexico relations. At the time that the Coyame incident happened, 1974, Echeverria and Ford, as we mentioned, were the presidents of the respective countries, and there was good relations between the two countries. But the U.S. and Mexico were, they had kind of an informal agreement that if the U.S. lost military hardware in northern Mexico, they were allowed to come over and retrieve it. So we have found instances of where test missiles, experimental aircraft, test missiles, things like that, shot out of New Mexico, Arizona. Even one of them was fired out of California, and they went down in northwestern Mexico along the Texas border, and the U.S. was given permission to go there and make the retrieval. Even in the case of the Athena missile crash, where you had it wasn't a full radioactive warhead, but there were radioactive materials aboard the Athena missile when it crashed. And again, the U.S. went down, retrieved its hardware, and did a kind of a cleanup of the area under the auspices of the Mexican government. But the interesting thing is that when this incident happened, supposedly the crash retrieval, the U.S. crash retrieval of the downed UFO was conducted by the Central Intelligence Agency. That would be after the Mexican retrieval team failed to recover the UFO, and the U.S. interceded on short notice, staging a recovery team at Fort Bliss in El Paso, conducted by the CIA. They went down there in unmarked helicopters. They were to disavow, if caught, that they had anything to do with the U.S. government. So they made that retrieval. They brought the downed UFO into Texas, according to the Deneb document. The CIA at that time had a headquarters in Mexico City, as well as in other Mexican cities. As we mentioned, relations were good between the two countries. But perhaps the fact that this incident happened the way it did, with the CIA ending up with the goods, so to speak, maybe that is what occasioned the meeting between Ford and Echeverria on the Texas border shortly after the incident happened. And then the other possibility, Ruben and I have been told that the Mexican soldiers didn't just die, that they were eliminated in order that the crash materials could be recovered. And that is wild speculation. Ruben and I have seen no documentation that was the case, but that's one theory that's out there in cyberspace.
Right. And as far as the CIA getting involved in crash retrievals, that is not unprecedented at all. There are a couple of very famous cases that we know about that absolutely did happen. There was one case involving, and the CIA going to great lengths to recover crash materials. There was the case involving a downed Soviet spy plane over Africa that they simply couldn't find because it disappeared into the jungle. And they were able to use remote viewers to find the location, and apparently that was one of the great successes of the remote viewing program. And some of you guys might be in the age demographic to remember the very famous Glomar Explorer case involving Howard Hughes, where they commissioned Howard Hughes to build a ship to pull a Soviet sub off the bottom of the Pacific Ocean floor. So the idea that the CIA wouldn't be involved in crash retrievals, or that they wouldn't go to extraordinary lengths to retrieve that material, that's a fact. So we know about those particular incidents.
And in the narrative about this story, the story goes that the U.S. requested permission to assist the Mexican government in recovering going to the crash site where the UFO and the small plane had crashed and come down in the desert, and that the Mexican government had denied the U.S. permission to become involved. That to me sends a little bit of a warning bell there. And then the next thing we know, all the Mexican recovery team members were dead, and the U.S. swooped in via an unmarked aircraft, supposedly piloted by the CIA, controlled by the CIA, to make the recovery of the object. All of this is very strange.
Got it. And also, there is an instance involving, we've already discussed the collision between the UFO and a plane. And there is a pilot by the name of Enrique Rivera Gutierrez, who is apparently passed away in August of '74. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Carlos, you did the research looking at the newspaper. I believe you looked at the newspaper out of Ciudad Juarez, and you found a story about a pilot, Enrique Rivera Gutierrez, who died around August 1974, and we thought maybe that was the pilot of the small plane. What do you think?
Yes, as I mentioned before, we look for some news all around that date, and continue we find an strange news, and nothing is for coincidence. And also I want to comment that I have the opportunity to talk with a Mexican military, and also he had the opportunity to check the names that Noe and Ruben gave me many years ago. They told me that list of names, I think was 4 or 5 names, belongs to the soldiers, to the Mexican soldier that was dead at that time, and that's the Mexican military. This is a premiere for all of you, that the name of that 4 or 5 names really exists in the Mexican military, but have died many years ago.
Yeah, that was an interesting angle, Frank. I should add the stories, the names that Carlos is talking about were suddenly posted on the Wikipedia article that Ruben and I initially wrote about the Coyame UFO incident. We wrote it, and then somebody went in and added the names of several of the soldiers from Mexico and several of the soldiers from the U.S. who took part in the crash retrieval. We don't know who was the person that put those names into the Wikipedia article, and Wikipedia refused to disclose the source. We contacted the person by email who posted those names, and they never responded to us as to who they were, what their identity was. So that was another big mystery in this case. How did they know the names? And as Carlos just said, those were actual members of the Mexican military from around that time period. So how did they know?
Got it. Got it. That is interesting. Have you been able to run down any of the names?
Carlos has done research on the Mexican soldiers that were named, and he found those names, those exact names, in the service records for Mexican military. Although, of course, we don't have specific information as to where they were in August of 1974. We do know that they were at one time members of the Mexican military.
Yes, you are right.
Okay. Now, I've also got in the information that you all sent me regarding this, a Witness of Another World, an official trailer. Now, is that connected to this case, or is that something else?
Oh, that is something else.
Okay, got it. You guys want to talk about that a little bit before we wrap up?
Well, I think Carlos and Noe, and as well as some other colleagues and I have been working on different projects, and I know that Carlos has worked on several new books, some related to crash retrievals with another colleague, Alfonso Salazar, and just wondering briefly if
Ruben,
we could share.
Yeah, Ruben, I'd like to jump in on our latest project, if we could, Frank.
Yep. Go for it.
This Coyame incident happened within maybe 20 or 30 miles of a famous place in Texas where some strange lights have been appearing since the 1800s, called the Marfa lights.
Sure.
And it's a strange phenomenon that to this day remains unexplained, even though a lot of scientific studies have been conducted. Some people think it's geologic, geothermal, mineralogical in nature. And so almost every night in the small town of Marfa, Texas, which is directly across the border from where the events we've been talking about on this show in Coyame took place, right on the Texas side is the small town of Marfa, which Ruben and I have been to, and many times we've gone out there. We've taken other UFO researchers out there to look at them. We recently went out with Travis Walton and a number of other researchers to look at these lights and the UFO people. Well, those lights have been seen since the 1800s, as I mentioned. And so Ruben and I and another part of our research team, John LeMay, who lives in Roswell, New Mexico, we came out with a book called The Real Cowboys and Aliens, UFO Encounters of the Old West. And that book included a chapter on the Marfa lights, which were first seen by cowboys, Texas cowboys, back in 1888. And we also have in the book many other cases that occurred in the 1800s, in the 19th century. And so Ruben and I and John have been working on follow-up book now, which we're about to release. It's going to be a 3-book series, The Real Cowboys and Aliens, which we're very excited about. So that's been taking up a lot of our time recently.
Got it. Now, your book on the Coyame case, the Coyame incident, that is available now over at Roswell Books, your website?
Yeah, RoswellBooks.com. We have more information on that. The original book was called Mexico's Roswell, and then we followed it up with a second book about the case called the Coyame incident, which went more into depth and included new information. So the original book, Mexico's Roswell, came out in a first edition, and then we had a second edition, and then the third updating of the story was the book, The Coyame Incident, which is also available in color with all the photographs in it in color, which is, there's some very nice photographs that we took over the years of Coyame and the surrounding desert. It turned out really well in as a color edition, but we mainly what folks mainly get are is the regular black and white version.
And you've got another book available over there at RoswellBooks.com, the Cisco Grove UFO encounter. Can you give us a quick synopsis of that case?
I'm going to turn that over to my friend Ruben, as he was the primary mover and shaker on that story. Ruben?
Primarily, thank you, Noe. We investigated a case that it's a historical case, happened in 1964 up in the mountains of Northern California, going toward Truckee and toward Reno, where a gentleman and his friends were that weekend were involved in bow and arrow hunting, and he had an encounter while hunting with these humanoids, and also he had observed this large cylinder-shaped object. And what he did was he climbed up a tree and stood up and had used the tree as a refuge, and was avoiding being captured by these entities. So it's a whole story, and it really happened. We have his testimony. Really an interesting case.
Got it. Okay. Well, yeah, let's wrap this up, everybody. I'd like to thank our guests for today, Noe Torres, Ruben Uriarte, Carlos Guzman, and Tony Ramirez. Thanks, gentlemen, for coming on with us. This is an amazing case that definitely deserves a good bit more attention. Head on over to Roswell Books, and you'll see Noe and Ruben's entire bibliography over there. And by all means, go find out more about it, because I think we kind of just scratched the surface today. So, gentlemen, thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us, Frank. We really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. So I am going to wrap things up. We are going to be back on Tuesday. Hopefully Chant is able to join us because Spyros Malaris is going to talk a little bit about the alien autopsy case, the video that he was involved in producing, a fake video that he's going to tell us all about. But there are still some people who are involved in that are trying to lead people into believing that that is a legitimate video, when in fact it's not. But we're going to go into some detail on that. That's been getting a lot of attention lately, so that's going to be a lot of fun. We've got that scheduled for Tuesday, and then next weekend is Labor Day weekend. So guess what I'm going to be doing? I'm going to be taking off and relaxing and having some fun. Gentlemen, again, thanks for coming on. Enjoy your Labor Day holiday coming up next week. And goodbye, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.